Hello Eastview Scholars, welcome to this tutorial on the chemistry you're probably going to need for anatomy. And let's put it this way, if you remember the basics and then can look at stuff, I'm going to run through this video pretty quick because we don't need to have a whole new chemistry tutorial or class, but it's just remembering some of the basics about chemistry so that you can apply it. Because we are like every living organism, and you can see one of my favorite little Billy Bryson quotes from his book, A Short History of Nearly Everything. We really are carbon-based organic creatures that run off of millions of chemical reactions, metabolic interactions and stuff that goes on. But we have to have that separation, one of those things that all living organisms need is separation, and the separation there is needing some organic molecules that are either non-polar or slightly polar, stuff like that, organic stuff for structure and protection, and some movement, and some, like glucose, which you break down for cell respiration and stuff. But we also need the ionic stuff to transport electricity in the nervous system and create differentials of potential differentials across, say, muscle membranes, so that you can have a contraction and stuff like that. So if you remember your basics, as we're going to go through, of what are ionic bonds and different types of reactions in the organic molecules. And I'm not necessarily going to explain everything that's going on, but you can refer back, and as we work through different systems, you'll see the application of it. And that's more important, is not really memorizing a chemistry class, but again, can you apply that knowledge of the big principles? So anatomy, very much like we did in biology, you're looking at carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and this one I put calcium over here. In biology, we would call it chenops with the sulfur in here. I lean more towards calcium because, as we're going to see with the calcium ion, it is a trigger for nerve impulses, for muscle contractions, for releases of lots of different chemicals from the body. So it's not just what it does as far as a structure for bone and skeletal structure, but stuff. And then, of course, the ions here, sodium, potassium, key in the sodium-potassium pump, and other deals there. Iron for carrying hemoglobin, in the hemoglobin molecule for carrying oxygen in the blood, and things along that line. So these are the areas of the periodic table we work with. And then again, you should be able to remember how to distinguish protons, neutrons, electrons, read the periodic table, determine what element you are working with, and then the bonding. Of course, both types, all sorts of bonding is going on in you. Covalent bonding, very important. That sharing of electrons, very strong chemical bond. And the more bonds they share, the less flexible they are. And this is where a lot of our structure and stuff comes in, and protection and separation of different environments. And remember, just because they share electrons doesn't mean they share equally. So there's polar and non-polar bonds and stuff. Polar covalent, unequal sharing. And with polar bonds, then you can have very much interactions like you do with ionic bonds. If you think back to determining bonds, it's basically a spectrum from ionic basically down to non-polar covalent, and somewhere in between. And so you have things like water that are covalently bonded but right on that ionic border, so they can have properties and interact with ionic molecules and stuff that allows them the properties that they have. And again, without going into hours of discussion and lecture on everything that's going on, you'll see it as we go through the different systems. Just as if you think back in biology when you talked about cell respiration and diffusion and osmosis and electron transport and photosynthesis, how gradients and interactions between organic and inorganic molecules worked. And of course, one of the biggest things for us is that carbon and hydrogen are so close, they're essentially nonpolar, which means that they won't dissolve in polar solvents like water. That would be not beneficial for you, because polar, remember, like dissolves like. So anything polar, strongly polar, or ionic will dissolve in water, which is a polar solvent, and non-polar will not. That would require ethers and alcohols and stuff like that. So that allows you the structure to have skin and cells and stuff without them being dissolved by the 2/3 water that you are. And the key to this, of course, with the bonding, as we were talking about, is that electronegativity difference, which, if you recall, is the attraction of an atom for the electrons of a covalent bond, that they're not sharing evenly. So kind of like when a really popular person like me gets to a party, everybody's kind of dispersed, and then all of a sudden the popular person like myself comes in, and then folks gravitate towards that, and there's an unequal sharing. Okay, and just a little quick for our thing, scale of electronegativity, you know, oxygen is greater than nitrogen, and carbon and hydrogen are about the same. Okay, and this is a good basis as we get to organic molecules of looking at then most of those organic molecules that are in us start with carbon, hydrogen, and that makes them nonpolar. And then you have to substitute in things like chlorines and oxygens and nitrogens to make them slightly polar, to give them properties that they will employ in making all the metabolism and the machinery and the muscles and the different systems work. Okay? Quick run through of your reaction types. Remember, there's synthesis reactions, where essentially you're combining two substances into one, or decomposition, where you're breaking something down. You have both single and double replacement and switching anions and cations particularly, and then combustion reactions, and being that we break down glucose and stuff, those things occur and produce water and oxygen. Then a quick run through organic molecules. You've had some sampling of this both in chemistry and biology. The big thing again is to understand the groups and their functions. So as we talk about the structure of the cell and go into the different functions of the different system and how they're different, how their structures are put together differently, it will be important to remember what they are and their main functions. All of these, now the carbohydrates, the sugars, the oses, are really your main energy fuel source. They're not the best one. The best energy comes from fats, but they're the easiest to break down. And that's why glucose is number one. But it's not their only function. It is their main function, but as with most of these organic molecules, there's other functions that they do. For example, there's glycocalyx. There's carbohydrates on the outside of your cells that help to identify you as you, which is part of that recognition for your immune system to know which is you, which is why, even though it might be a close relative, if you get a transplant or something along that line, they are looking for folks whose has a very similar structure outside their cells with some of those, with the glycocalyx and some of that stuff that will match and minimize the rejection possibility from the immune system. But you also have to take immunosuppressant drugs, regardless of who it is. And one of the interests in cloning is that you could clone your own and not have that rejection issue, nor the immune suppressant issue, which makes you then more susceptible to the common cold and things like that. Okay. And glucose is stored as glycogen. That's another function there of storing energy besides breaking it down. The fats, which are generally a long fatty acid chain, as you can see here on this kind of light deal, but here you have, they have numerous jobs. They're all around. There's energy storage in there. There's structural storage. There's chemical. There's steroid production like cholesterol. All the steroids are based on cholesterol. There's phospholipids, which are your basic cell membrane, triglycerides, and stuff. So they are kind of the jack of all trades in stuff. And so as we talk about things like cell membrane structure and stuff, we'll get into lipids besides their energy storage. Proteins, of course, you should remember, are your main structural component, 30% of your cell mass, and that's their main job with amino acids. And of course they have initially the amino acid sequence is your primary structure, and then they either fold into an alpha helix or a pleated sheet for their secondary structure, and then the tertiary structure, really making them a functional protein, is when the side chains start binding and folding upon each other. And then like hemoglobin, if you have different proteins, hemoglobin has 4 different proteins. If you have different proteins going together to make a functional structure like hemoglobin, that's the quaternary. Again, protein, like everything else, has other structures also, or functions, but really structure is the main deal for it. And then the nucleic acids. This is your genetic code. This is how you encode proteins, which you should refresh yourself on transcription and translation and how proteins are made. This is you. This is the characteristics of you, made up of nucleotides, which is your sugar, right, and your phosphate group, and then your base, your nitrogenous base. Okay. And when we get into organic molecules, we'll again talk about these all peptide bonds and carbohydrate bonds, like when glucose puts glycogen together, the the bonding here is all a dehydration synthesis, so water comes off as these things bond together. Okay, so that's a quick run through of the chemistry. That's just to give you an outline. If you can recall most of your basic chemistry and some of your biology around the organic molecules, that is plenty to know. Know that really the important part of it is the application that we put through the different systems and through keeping homeostatic balance throughout your system to keep you on an even keel. Anyhow, so feel free to run through that chapter in the review sheets to give yourself more background and ask questions if need be in class. Until then, scholar up, Eastview.